Imagine for a second that you've just been handed the keys to the most magnificent, flawlessly constructed mansion in the world.
Oh, wow. Sounds like a pretty good deal.
Right. I mean, we're talking breathtaking generational architecture.
The absolute dream.
Every room is perfectly appointed. The foundation is rock solid. The landscaping is just, it's immaculate. All you have to do is literally walk through the front door and live there.
I think I could manage that.
Yeah, it sounds like the ultimate dream. But, here's the catch.
There's always a catch.
Always. Everywhere you walk in that house, there are these massive portraits staring down at you.
Let me guess. The person who built it.
Exactly. And every single guest who comes over, they just spend the entire evening talking about the genius of the architect who designed the dining room.
Yeah, that would get old really fast.
Right. Because you didn't build the house. You're just living in it.
You're essentially just a tenant in someone else's legacy.
Exactly. And pretty soon, that magnificent mansion starts to feel, less like a dream home and a whole lot more like a beautifully decorated prison.
Yeah, there's absolutely no oxygen left in the room for your own identity.
And that right there, that dynamic, is the core of what we are unpacking today. So, to our listener out there, the learner, welcome to the deep dive.
We are so glad you're here with us.
Today we're investigating a really profound paradox of power and success.
That's a fascinating one.
It really is. Why is it that inheriting a massive advantage like taking over a booming family business or inheriting a famous last name is so often the quickest path to complete and utter ruin?
What's fascinating here is that it fundamentally contradicts our basic human intuition.
It totally does.
Right. Logic tells us that it's always easier to build on an existing foundation.
I mean, if someone has already done the hard work, laid the groundwork, shouldn't you just take the baton and keep running?
You'd think so. But if we look at the historical and psychological sources we have today, a really stark, counterintuitive truth emerges.
Yeah, what comes first always appears better and more original to the human mind.
Exactly. If you succeed a truly great person, you don't just have to be as good as them to be considered an equal.
No, you have to accomplish double their achievements just to step out of their shadow.
It's a brutal standard. And we're dealing with a concept from our sources often referred to as the 41st law of power.
Which states, avoid stepping into a great man's shoes.
Right, because if you wear those shoes, you're going to trip.
Double the achievements just to break even in the eyes of the world. That is just, it's so heavy.
It's an impossible weight.
So today, we're going to figure out exactly why this happens.
We're exploring the historical disasters of those who wore the shoes anyway.
And the deep psychological reasons why comfort actually destroys our edge.
Plus, most importantly, the tactical maneuvers you have to use to, metaphorically speaking, slay the predecessor.
Slay the father, I love that. We're going to figure out how to dodge the trap of inherited success and carve an entirely new path.
So you don't get swallowed whole by the shadows of giants.
So, to understand why inheriting greatness is such a devastating trap, we really need to look at the ultimate historical cautionary tale.
We need to examine the concept of necessity.
And there's no better way to do that than through the lens of King Louis XIV of France and his great-grandson, Louis XV.
The ultimate contrast between a builder and an inheritor.
Exactly. The tale of two kings. Let's set the stage with Louis XIV, the famous Sun King.
Because to understand the sheer scale of the shoes that needed filling, you have to look at the absolute chaos he was born into.
Oh, it was a mess. When Louis XIV was coming up in the 1640s, France was not the polished, dominant power we picture today.
Not at all. It was completely fractured.
The country was descending into a series of civil wars known as the Fronde. The nobility was actively rebelling against the crown.
I mean, as a child, Louis XIV literally had to flee Paris in the middle of the night.
Just to avoid being captured or killed by his own aristocrats.
Right. So he takes this decaying, chaotic void of a monarchy.
And through sheer force of will and desperate necessity, he forges it into the preeminent realm in all of Europe.
He was terrifyingly powerful.
Seriously. I mean, great generals would literally tremble in his presence.
The sources mention that account of a cook, right?
Yes. A cook who made a mistake preparing a dish for him and actually committed suicide rather than face the king's wrath.
That is just an almost gravitational level of power.
It's absolute radiant authority.
And what is crucial here is how he consolidated that power. He didn't just build armies.
No, he built an entirely new symbolic universe.
The traditional palace of the French kings was the Louvre in Paris.
But Louis XIV recognized that the Louvre was filled with the ghosts of his predecessors.
Right, and it was surrounded by the very Parisian nobility who had tried to overthrow him in the first place.
So he completely refuses the Louvre. He says no.
Instead, he goes out to this swampy, unremarkable hunting lodge in Versailles.
A literal swamp. And he decides to build the most magnificent palace the world has ever seen right there.
He physically removes the seat of government from the established path.
He forces everyone to come to him, on his terms, in a world he built from scratch.
It's exactly like a scrappy startup founder who builds a multi-billion-dollar empire in a garage.
Yes,
Yeah.
that is the perfect analogy. That founder knows every single nut and bolt of the machinery.
Because they absolutely had to build it with their own two hands to survive.
They understand the business intimately because they birthed it out of the threat of failure.
And necessity is the operative word here.
Louis XIV imposed order on chaos because his survival literally depended on it.
Machiavelli actually wrote extensively about this exact phenomenon centuries earlier.
Oh, right. What did he say?
He observed that necessity is the primary engine of human achievement. It impels action.
It forces you to move.
Exactly. When necessity is gone, when the desperate burning need to secure your survival is removed, human nature just defaults to inertia.
We get lazy.
We get very lazy. And that brings us to 1715.
The Sun King dies.
After a glorious 55-year reign, yes. And the crown passes to his great-grandson, Louis XV,
Who is just 5 years old at the time.
a child inheriting the most perfectly tuned, powerful political machine on the planet.
Talk about a silver spoon.
Right. And the establishment naturally assumed this kid would take this incredible firm foundation and elevate it even further.
So they gave him the absolute best minds in France as his tutors.
They taught him statecraft. They instructed him in the exact methods his great-grandfather had perfected.
Absolutely nothing was neglected in his education.
It was a completely frictionless upbringing.
But then 1726 rolls around, and Louis XV officially takes full control of the throne.
And a profound, really dangerous psychological reality sets in.
He looks around and realizes he is totally alone at the top of a wealthy, powerful, peaceful country.
He doesn't have to fight off rebellious nobles.
He doesn't have to build a palace to prove his majesty.
He doesn't have to do anything at all.
The necessity is completely gone.
Completely. And what follows is a descent into banality that is just staggering to look back on.
It's almost unbelievable. Initially, he hands the actual work of governing over to a trusted minister.
André Hercule de Fleury.
Right, and people at court assumed, okay, the king is young, he needs a few years to enjoy his youth.
He'll take the reins eventually.
But he never took the reins. Louis XV simply had zero interest in governing.
Looming financial crises.
Not his problem.
Tensions with other European powers.
He couldn't care less. I mean, his absolute biggest, most pressing enemy in life was simply his own boredom.
He was pathologically terrified of being bored.
Which is the ultimate luxury of the inheritor, isn't it?
It really is. When you aren't fighting for survival, your brain just constantly seeks novel stimuli.
And he sought it out in the most destructive ways possible.
What was he doing instead of ruling?
Well, when he wasn't obsessively hunting deer, which he did constantly, he was sitting at the gambling tables at Versailles.
Just casually losing vast, monumental sums of the state's money in a single night.
Exactly. And because the court always reflects the ruler, the entire culture of Versailles shifted.
It stopped being this awe-inspiring epicenter of European strategy.
And it just turned into an obsessive, vapid echo chamber.
The courtiers realized that the king didn't value hard work or strategic brilliance.
No, he valued entertainment. So they stopped caring about the future of France.
All they cared about was charming the king.
Angling for titles that provided life pensions and begging for cabinet positions that paid huge salaries but required zero actual work.
The palace just became flooded with parasites.
It's so sad. Versailles transitioned from a symbol of monumental authority to a pleasure palace of incomparable banality.
The architecture remained the same, but the soul of the institution had completely rotted out.
And this rot extended directly into the political apparatus, too.
The political meddling became absolutely absurd.
In 1745, he elevates Madame de Pompadour to the role of official royal mistress.
But she doesn't just hold social influence.
No, she essentially emerges as the unofficial prime minister of France.
She wields the hiring and firing power over the country's most important ministers.
And she's basing her decisions not on competence, but on who flatters her the most.
And this pattern only deepens over time. After she passes away, Madame de Berry steps into the vacuum.
And there's a specific incident with her that left all of Europe aghast.
Oh, the firing of Etienne de Choiseul.
Yes, he was the foreign minister and widely considered France's most able, competent diplomat at the time.
And why was he fired?
Because he supposedly showed Madame de Berry a lack of respect in a social setting.
The entire state apparatus, the very security of the nation, was being dismantled over petty, interpersonal court dramas.
It's insane. Louis XV even builds a private brothel called the Parc aux Cerfs right on the grounds of Versailles.
Complete with hidden staircases.
Swindlers, charlatans, and astrologers just make their nests in the palace because the king is constantly looking for the next distraction.
The teenager who inherited the greatest kingdom on earth just allows it to atrophy.
Culminating in the infamous motto attached to his reign. Après moi le déluge.
After me, the flood.
Let it all wash away after I'm gone, which is exactly what happened.
His successor, Louis XVI, inherits a bankrupt, disorganized mess.
And a few years later, his head rolls off the guillotine.
The magnificent mansion was completely destroyed because the inheritor never learned how to maintain the foundation.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is a really grim realization.
It's definitely a dark piece of history.
If having everything handed to you destroys your drive, and if peace and prosperity inevitably lead to this kind of systemic rot, what are we supposed to do?
That is the million-dollar question.
Is the only solution to voluntarily make yourself miserable? Do we actually need to experience suffering, poverty, or the threat of a guillotine to be great?
It sounds counterproductive, right?
Yeah. Because if I'm a learner listening to this on my way to a comfortable corporate job, I don't want to ruin my life just to find my edge.
No, absolutely not. That is the essential paradox here.
So how do we solve it?
To answer that, we need to shift our focus from the macro politics of empires down to the micropsychology of individual creators.
Okay, I like that.
Because you are right, seeking out actual ruinous suffering is not a sustainable life strategy.
Good. I'm glad we agree on that.
However, the psychological mechanism remains true. Greatness requires necessity.
So, if you aren't born into poverty or chaos, what do you do?
The challenge becomes engineering that necessity artificially.
Engineering artificial poverty.
Exactly. You have to learn how to trick your own brain into feeling the stakes of survival.
That sounds incredibly difficult to balance, but when you look at how historical figures manage this, it is fascinating.
Who comes to mind?
Take the Renaissance painter Pietro Perugino.
Oh, yes.
When he first moved to Florence, he was absolutely destitute. He spent months living in grinding, humiliating poverty.
He was sleeping in a box, wasn't he?
Literally. He didn't even own a bed. He slept inside a wooden chest.
That is rough.
But that environment triggered something profound in him. He turned night into day.
He worked relentlessly.
Constantly painting, driven by this absolute visceral dread of remaining poor.
And Perugino was acutely aware of what that suffering did for him.
He was.
Yeah, he later reflected that this intense burning need spurred him to heights of excellence he likely never would have reached otherwise.
Wow. So the poverty was his fuel.
Exactly. If he had started with wealth, that comfort would have insulated him. It might have closed the path to his own talent.
He took no notice of cold, hunger, or exhaustion because the necessity to survive literally propelled his brushstrokes.
His brain was in a constant state of high-stakes problem solving.
But again, that's actual poverty. It's easy to say, hunger makes you work harder.
Right, yeah.
The real question is what happens when you finally get the money and the comfort? Do you just lose the talent?
That's the danger.
Look at the playwright Tennessee Williams. The story of what happened to him after his first massive success perfectly illustrates this biological reaction to comfort.
It's a textbook example.
He writes The Glass Menagerie, and it is a skyrocketing success.
Huge hit.
He goes from total obscurity and financial struggle to sudden, overwhelming wealth and fame.
You'd assume he'd be ecstatic. He finally achieved the dream.
Right. But instead he suffers a severe nervous breakdown.
Williams' own analysis of that period is incredibly revealing.
What did he realize?
He realized that his life before the success required endurance. It was a life of, as he put it, clawing and scratching.
Clawing and scratching.
And crucially, he recognized that this struggle wasn't just a phase to get through. It was a fundamental biological state.
He believed humans are organisms built for the struggle.
Exactly. We are designed to climb, not to sit idle at the summit.
So when the struggle was suddenly removed, when he finally had total financial security,
His cortisol dropped, his adrenaline faded.
and he looked around at his comfortable life and became deeply, paralyzingly depressed.
The vital energy that fueled his art was tied directly to his struggle.
So his nervous breakdown wasn't just a random illness.
No, it was his mind and body reacting to the sudden lack of necessity.
It wasn't until he was pushed back to the psychological edge by his own depression that he found that old vitality again.
And that's when he wrote A Streetcar Named Desire.
That is wild.
The brain is highly efficient. If it doesn't perceive a threat or a deficit, it stops expending the massive amount of cognitive energy required for breakthrough creativity.
It just conserves energy.
This is why complacency is a biological default, not just a moral failing.
And some individuals went to extreme lengths to bypass this default.
Like Dostoevsky.
Yes. The Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky took this concept to its absolute, most destructive limit.
His method is almost unbelievable.
It really is. Whenever he wrote a successful novel and gained a measure of financial security, he felt the fire go out.
The act of creation was no longer a matter of life and death.
So he couldn't produce. And his solution wasn't to take a vacation and find inspiration.
Oh, no.
He would literally take his entire life savings, march into a casino, and sit at the roulette tables until he had gambled away his very last penny.
Just voluntarily bankrupting himself.
Only when he was reduced to absolute desperate poverty again, when he was facing ruin and creditors, could he feel the agonizing necessity required to sit down and write his next masterpiece.
He manufactured a crisis to force his brain into a flow state.
Which, obviously, we are not recommending.
No. Bankrupting yourself is a pathology, not a sustainable strategy.
Definitely don't do that.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the lesson is about recognizing the lethargy that comfort breeds and finding ways to disrupt it.
You have to manufacture the void.
Pablo Picasso offers a much healthier, yet equally rigorous model for this kind of artificial necessity.
How so? Because Picasso was phenomenally wealthy and successful for most of his life.
Right.
How did he avoid the Tennessee Williams trap without going to the casino like Dostoevsky?
Picasso handled success by aggressively refusing to rest on it.
What do you mean?
Whenever a specific style of his painting became famous, highly praised, and highly lucrative, he would deliberately and completely break with it.
He would just stop doing what worked.
He would abandon the very technique that made him successful. He forced himself to learn an entirely new style from scratch.
Whether it was the Blue Period Cubism or Surrealism?
He was constantly discarding his past. He essentially fired himself from his own successful job over and over again.
He burned his artistic safety net.
Exactly. Instead of burning his money, he burned his established reputation.
He forced himself back to the bottom of the learning curve where he had to struggle to figure things out again.
Yes. For you, the learner, listening to this, the practical application is about your psychological posture.
Early triumphs have a terrifying tendency to turn us into caricatures of ourselves.
You find a formula that works, you get promoted, and suddenly you start repeating the hits because it feels safe.
But to maintain real power and relevance, you have to fight the biological urge to grow fat and lazy with prosperity.
You must continuously engineer a sense of necessity.
Volunteer for a project in a department you know nothing about.
Force yourself to learn a new technology that makes your current skills obsolete.
You must be prepared to return to square one psychologically.
Right. So we've established the internal battle. Comfort and inherited success breed rot, and you have to fight your own complacency.
But let's look outward now. What happens when the threat isn't just your own laziness, but an actual towering predecessor?
That's a whole different game.
Right. If you step into a role previously held by a giant, a legendary CEO, a brilliant founder, or a famously successful parent, how do you actively escape their shadow?
Well, you cannot passively wait for the shadow to fade.
You have to go on the offensive.
You have to commit the ultimate symbolic rebellion. You have to slay the father.
Slaying the father. I love that phrasing. And historically, there is no greater case study for this than Alexander the Great.
The ultimate exception to the rule.
Exactly. Alexander is an incredibly rare example of a son who inherits a massive, thriving empire and actually manages to completely surpass a wildly successful father.
And to appreciate Alexander's feat, we have to look at the father he was up against.
King Philip of Macedonia.
Right. King Philip was not a placeholder king. He was a titan.
He took Macedonia from a peripheral kingdom and built a military machine that conquered most of Greece.
He was cunning, ruthlessly successful, and deeply domineering.
For any normal heir, Philip's legacy would have been an impenetrable ceiling.
But Alexander didn't worship Philip.
Not at all. In fact, his psychological profile reveals this intense burning resentment.
As a young man, Alexander absolutely loathed his father.
He hated Philip's cautious style of diplomacy. He hated his bombastic speeches, his heavy drinking.
His ruminizing, even his love of wrestling, which Alexander viewed as an undignified waste of time.
While other wealthy sons of the nobility were comfortably enjoying their trust funds and riding their father's coattails,
Alexander was consumed by an existential dread.
he was terrified that his father would leave him no glory.
He actually complained to his friends once, saying, "My father will go on conquering till there's nothing extraordinary left for me to do."
That statement perfectly encapsulates the mindset of someone who refuses to be a mere inheritor.
He did not want to be a steward of Philip's accomplishments. He wanted to be a creator.
He intuitively understood that the only way to establish his own identity was to completely eclipse the man who gave him his platform.
And the historical accounts give us these incredible tense moments where Alexander constantly challenged Philip's dominance.
Engaging in what were essentially proxy wars for alpha status.
The story of taming Bucephalus is the most famous example of this.
Oh man, such a great story. So a horse dealer brings this magnificent prize horse, Bucephalus, to King Philip.
But the beast is completely savage.
Right. None of Philip's expert grooms, the absolute best horsemen in Macedonia, can get anywhere near it.
So Philip gets annoyed and tells the merchant to take the useless horse away.
But young Alexander is watching this whole scene unfold.
And he's not going to just let it go.
No, he starts scowling and loudly complaining right in front of the whole court. He says, "What a horse they are losing for want of skill and spirit."
Just totally undermining his dad in public.
He repeats it until Philip finally snaps. Philip challenges the boy to ride the horse himself.
Secretly hoping Alexander would get thrown and learn a bitter public lesson in humility.
We see the classic tension between the self-made father and the ambitious son.
Philip felt threatened by his son's youthful vigor.
He half wanted to see Alexander fail, to reinforce his own irreplaceable dominance.
It's a dynamic you see in corporate transitions all the time, when a founder refuses to truly hand over the reins.
But Alexander doesn't fail. He notices something the older, experienced men missed.
What was it?
The horse is terrified of its own shadow. So Alexander turns Bucephalus toward the sun, mounts the savage beast, tames it, and rides it at a full gallop.
And the court erupts in applause.
But Philip is just seething. He realizes he is no longer looking at an heir, he is looking at a rival.
And Alexander's defiance just escalates from there.
There is an incredibly tense moment at a royal banquet celebrating Philip's new marriage.
Philip has been drinking heavily, as usual.
Right, and he gets into a heated argument with Alexander. Philip actually draws his sword and lunges at his own son.
But he's so drunk he trips and falls flat on his face.
And Alexander, standing over him, points at his father in front of all the hardened generals of Macedonia.
And he jeers at him.
He says, "See there the man who is preparing to pass from Europe to Asia. He cannot pass from one table to another without falling."
Man, that is cold.
It is a brutal, calculated public dismantling of the father figure's aura.
He is stripping away the myth of Philip's invincibility.
And this psychological rebellion translates directly into political strategy the moment Philip is assassinated.
Alexander's only 18 when he takes the throne.
The news of Philip's death spreads, and immediately the conquered Greek cities rise up in rebellion.
Thinking a teenager will be easy to defeat.
Philip's old, experienced advisors, the men who built the empire, they beg Alexander to play it safe.
They tell him to use his father's cunning, diplomatic, cautious methods to slowly restore order.
So what does this all mean? They want him to run his father's playbook.
But Alexander completely ignores them.
He recognizes that playing his father's greatest hits will only solidify his status as a lesser copy.
Instead of caution, he marches out with brutal, terrifying efficiency.
He doesn't negotiate. He completely crushes the rebellious towns. He literally razes Thebes to the ground.
And reunites the empire at lightning speed.
He actively refuses to wear his father's shoes.
Which brings us to a historical moment that serves as the ultimate framework for rejecting the predecessor's paradigm.
The Gordian knot.
Exactly. Once Alexander consolidated Greece, he set his sights on the Persian Empire.
The massive looming prize that had eluded his father.
On his march, he passes through the town of Gordium in Phrygia.
And inside the main temple rests an ancient chariot tied with an incredibly intricate knot made of cornel tree bark.
The local prophecy stated that whoever could undo this knot would rule the entire world.
And historically, anyone who had tried to solve this puzzle approached it the exact same way.
They accepted the established rules of the knot,
They sat there, picking at the cords, trying to trace the lines.
painstakingly trying to untie it, based on the terms set by whoever tied it in the first place.
They engaged with the problem on the terms dictated by the past.
They respected the complexity of the precedent.
But Alexander looks at this massive, impossible knot. He realizes he cannot untie it with his bare hands.
But rather than walking away defeated or spending years playing a game, he can't win.
He changes the rule.
He draws his sword and violently slashes the knot completely in half.
He physically destroys the puzzle. It's such a brilliant display of lateral thinking.
It is a profound symbolic declaration.
Slashing the Gordian knot was Alexander announcing to the world and to his own army that he would not do as others did.
He would not painstakingly untangle the legacy of the past.
He was not going to be bound by the intricate, established methods of his father or anyone else.
He was going to blaze his own completely unprecedented path.
And that mental breakthrough propelled him to push past Persia all the way to the limits of the known world in India.
This translates so perfectly to the modern world.
It really does. We aren't commanding phalanxes, but we are constantly presented with Gordian knots in our careers and businesses.
There's this stubborn, almost superstitious cognitive bias that recurs throughout human history.
This belief that if the person before you succeeded by doing A, B, and C,
Then you have a sacred duty to diligently replicate A, B, and C.
it's the cookie-cutter approach to leadership.
It seduces people because it feels safe. It appeals to our natural timidity.
Just trace the footsteps of the successful predecessor, and if you fail, you can blame the system.
But the circumstances never repeat themselves exactly.
The psychological architecture of success is highly contextual.
A self-made pioneer, a visionary CEO, or a groundbreaking artist becomes domineering because they trust their own methods.
Those methods work for them in their specific time and place.
But when they impose those exact same lessons on their successor, who is operating in a completely different market with different technological realities,
Those lessons become an oppressive cage.
the successor gets cowed.
They become terrified of losing what was already gained, instead of being hungry for what comes next.
Alexander recognized that the privileges of his birth, the massive army he was handed, were actually psychological impediments.
He knew he had to be merciless with the past to unlock his own future.
However, we have to pause here and acknowledge the hidden cost of this strategy.
Right. It's not all glorious conquests.
Slashing the knot, rebelling against the established order, outshining the towering predecessor. It sounds incredibly empowering in theory.
But in actual practice, defeating the father figure carries a massive and sometimes unbearable psychological weight.
The guilt.
The unconscious guilt of usurping the crown.
This is where the historical data intersects with psychoanalysis, and it fundamentally shifts how we view leadership transitions.
So to understand this guilt, we look to an essay written in 1951 by the psychoanalyst Ernest Jones.
He was exploring the psychology of Paul Morphy, who was a brilliant, world-renowned 19th century chess champion.
Now, to understand Morphy's ultimate tragedy, we first have to understand the underlying psychology of chess itself.
We tend to think of chess as a polite, intellectual game, or at most a sterile substitute for the art of war.
But psychoanalytically, the unconscious motive driving the game is much darker and more specific.
It is essentially father murder.
Patricide played out on a checkered board.
Exactly. The ultimate goal of the game is to neutralize the opposing king.
The word checkmate literally derives from a Persian phrase meaning the king is dead or the king is helpless.
Even though modern rules only require sterilizing the king into immobility rather than removing him from the board.
The unconscious psychological goal remains exactly the same.
Overcoming, dominating, and neutralizing the ultimate patriarch in a socially acceptable, sublimated way.
Which brings us to the tragic timeline of Paul Morphy's life.
Morphy was an absolute prodigy, a genius at the game.
But his soaring, unstoppable odyssey into the highest, most brilliant realms of international chess didn't just happen randomly.
No, it began exactly 1 year after the sudden, unexpected death of his real-life father.
His father's death was a massive psychological shock.
Jones theorizes that Morphy's subsequent aggressive brilliance on the chessboard was a reaction to this critical event.
He was unconsciously acting out this sublimated conquest, repeatedly defeating the father figure on the board now that his real father was gone.
But what happened to Morphy after he achieved ultimate success, after he had beaten the greatest players in the world and stood alone at the summit, is the real cautionary tale.
He didn't celebrate?
No.
He suffered a complete mental collapse. He essentially abandoned the game and descended into paranoia and instability.
He was completely wrecked by his own victory.
Sigmund Freud actually coined a clinical term for this specific phenomenon,
Idea im Erfolgsscheitern.
which translates to those wrecked by success.
Freud pointed out that human beings often harbor deep, ambitious desires to overcome the father figure, or the boss, or the mentor.
But for many, they can only endure that conquest in their fantasy.
When they actually achieve it in reality, when they finally defeat the giant and take the crown.
The psychological shock of having actually committed the metaphorical murder is too much to bear.
Imagining taking the CEO role is a fun daydream. You think about all the things you would change.
But actually taking the role, actually sitting at the desk where your beloved mentor used to sit and realizing you have replaced them.
It provokes this immense, crushing, unconscious guilt.
The penalty for that presumptuousness can be severe imposter syndrome, self-sabotage, or, in Morphy's case, a literal mental breakdown.
The glaring light of publicity hit him. The biological stress of being the alpha overwhelmed his system.
And he collapsed under the weight of his own realized ambition.
And this guilt is not a modern neurosis. Human societies have recognized this deep-seated psychological danger for millennia.
Throughout history, cultures have developed elaborate, often violent rituals and myths specifically designed to mitigate the psychological trauma of replacing the leader.
They knew that the transition of power is inherently toxic.
The historical workarounds for this are intense.
Very intense.
In the ancient kingdoms of Bengal and Sumatra, they didn't rely on psychoanalysis. They relied on ritual execution.
After a king had ruled for a set number of years, his subjects would literally turn on him and execute him.
They would kill him in an elaborate public ritual.
And this wasn't just a chaotic mob. It was a deeply ingrained constitutional process of renewal.
They understood that if a king lives too long, he inevitably tries to establish a permanent order that oppresses the next generation.
He stops leading and starts dominating.
By ritually executing the king, the society prevented him from growing too powerful.
They violently cleared the board.
And in a brilliant psychological twist, once the king was dead and no longer an active, oppressive threat to the youth, they could safely worship him as a god.
The guilt was absolved because the execution was mandated by the gods or the stars.
The field was cleared, so a new, youthful order could establish itself without the paralyzing guilt of patricide.
And when societies evolved past literally executing their kings, they achieved the exact same psychological clearing through mythology.
They created legends that completely erased the human father, thereby freeing the hero from that oppressive shadow.
Think about Moses. He is abandoned in the bulrushes as an infant.
He never knew his earthly parents, so he had no human father to limit his potential or dictate his path.
Hercules has no earthly father. His dad is the god Zeus.
Even Alexander the Great, later in his life, actively encourages the rumor that his real father wasn't Philip of Macedonia, but the god Jupiter Ammon.
By claiming divine parentage, you eliminate the human predecessor entirely.
You remove the symbol of the destructive power of the past.
The hero doesn't have to bow and scrape to tradition, and they don't have to feel guilty for surpassing their ancestors because they owe nothing to mortal men.
They are entirely self-generated.
Okay, so ancient kings got executed, and mythological heroes just claimed their dad was Zeus to avoid imposter syndrome.
That's a great strategy if you're Hercules.
Right. But how do we practically apply this today?
If the learner is stepping into a new management role or trying to launch a product in a market dominated by a massive legacy brand, they can't exactly claim divine parentage.
Probably not a good HR move.
No. So how do you dodge the shadow of the past and avoid the crushing comparison without relying on mythology?
You do it by fundamentally changing the geography of the competition.
Meaning what, exactly?
You have to stop fighting your predecessor's territory and instead find the vacuums.
Find the vacuums.
You must identify the empty spaces and employ the power of symbolic distancing.
Okay, finding the empty space. This is where we look at Pericles of Athens.
A great example.
Pericles was born into a highly distinguished, incredibly wealthy, aristocratic family. He had every advantage in that sphere.
But he faced a massive perceptual problem.
He physically resembled a former tyrant of Athens named Pisistratus.
Pericles was terrified that if he entered politics acting like a traditional aristocrat, the public would immediately compare him to this tyrant.
Or to the current aristocratic idol, Simon. He feared he would be ostracized or accused of aiming for a dictatorship because he was walking on a path already crowded with ghosts.
So Pericles performs a brilliant strategic pivot.
He looks at the political landscape of Athens and realizes the aristocratic lane is completely blocked.
It is full of giant shadows.
So, going entirely against his own personal temperament and background, he throws his hat in with the poor and the democratic elements of the city. He totally reinvents his public persona.
He refuses invitations to lavish aristocratic dinners.
He was never seen walking in any street except the one leading directly to the marketplace and the council chamber.
He physically changed his route to avoid the old paths.
He didn't try to out the aristocrats.
He realized that mimicking their strength would only highlight his weakness.
Instead, he found a completely empty arena where he could be the first and principal figure to shine.
It's brilliant.
To use an ecological analogy, it's like planting a sapling directly under the canopy of a massive 500-year-old oak tree.
It doesn't matter how good the soil is.
Or how much you water it. The oak's massive shadow blocks all the sunlight.
To grow, you don't try to outcompete the oak for water in its own root system.
You have to let your seed be carried to a completely empty clearing where there is a vacuum of sunlight.
You have to change the game entirely.
It's like opening a business. If your predecessor built the greatest pizza empire in town, you don't try to open a slightly better pizza place.
Right. You open the town's first premium taco stand. You find the vacuum.
That is exactly right. You must occupy a field that has been cleared of the dead weight of the past.
The Spanish painter Diego de Velázquez executed this perfectly in the realm of art.
Oh, how so?
When he began his career, he looked at the grand, refined, perfectly proportioned technique of the great Renaissance painters who preceded him. Titian, Raphael, Michelangelo.
The heavy hitters.
He knew he could not compete with them on their own terms. Their refinement was absolute, the canopy was too thick.
So he pivoted hard into a vacuum.
He deliberately chose to work in a style that, by the standards of the time, seemed coarse, rough, and hyper-realistic.
He painted ordinary people, water carriers, and street scenes with thick, bold brushstrokes.
It was something entirely new, and it absolutely thrilled the Spanish court.
People secretly admire those who have the audacity to break old forms and reinvigorate the culture.
Entering a vacuum gives you incredible immediate power because there is no existing benchmark. You set the new standard.
And part of claiming that vacuum requires symbolic differentiation.
You have to advertise to the world through overt symbols that you are not your predecessor.
Look at the Roman Emperor Augustus. He had the seemingly impossible task of succeeding Julius Caesar.
Caesar was basically a god to the people, sweeping, theatrical, putting on massive public spectacles, seduced by Cleopatra.
He was larger than life, an absolute force of nature.
If Augustus had tried to be theatrical, if he had tried to throw bigger parties or act more dramatic.
He would have just looked like a cheap, try-hard imitation. He would have been playing Caesar's game.
Exactly. So Augustus projects the exact opposite imagery.
He bases his power on traditional Roman simplicity.
He wears plain, homespun togas woven by his wife.
He projects quiet, manly dignity and austerity. It was a completely different vibe that signaled a new era.
We see this exact same mastery of optics in the modern era with John F. Kennedy.
And just to look at this purely from a strategic standpoint, regardless of politics, because we're not taking political sides here on whose presidency was better.
No, absolutely not. We're purely looking at the brilliant optics Kennedy employed to separate himself from a towering predecessor.
Right. Kennedy's campaign was a masterclass in symbolic distancing from Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Eisenhower personified the 1950s. He was a grandfatherly figure, a steady general.
And his great, highly publicized passion was playing golf.
Symbolically, golf is a game of retirement, privilege, careful planning, and a slower, stodgier pace of life.
It perfectly matched the mood of a post-war America catching its breath.
But Kennedy knows he cannot play the fatherly game.
He's young, so he has to lean into youth as a weapon.
What does he do?
He makes sure the press photographs him out on the White House lawn playing touch football with his brothers.
Football is vigorous, it's rough, it's sweaty, it's dynamic.
It is the absolute antithesis of golf.
In every aspect of his administration, JFK used these visual symbols to radically distinguish himself from the past decade.
He stirred up the young against the old, tapping into that timeless, inherent resentment the next generation feels toward the shadow of their fathers.
Symbolic differentiation physically demonstrates your break from the past.
It's Louis XIV refusing the Louvre to build Versailles.
It's Philip II of Spain building the austere El Escorial Palace in the middle of nowhere.
You cannot be seen walking your predecessor's path, living in their house, or playing their game, or the public will never grant you your own identity.
And sometimes you literally have to destroy the playbook to force your team to look forward.
The story of General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines perfectly illustrates the danger of relying on past success.
During World War II, MacArthur takes command of the Southwest Pacific area.
One of his newly assigned assistants comes up to him, trying to be helpful, and hands him a thick, bound book.
This book contains all the precedents established by the commanders who came before him.
All the strategies, administrative rules, and methods that had successfully worked in the past.
MacArthur takes one look at this book and asks, how many copies of this book are there?
The assistant says 6.
And MacArthur replies, well, you get all those 6 copies together and burn them, every one of them.
It is a striking, ruthless strategy.
But we have to understand the cognitive mechanism behind why MacArthur did this. He wasn't just being dramatic.
He was fighting against anchoring bias.
Exactly.
Anchoring bias. Break that down for us.
Anchoring bias is a cognitive vulnerability where the human brain relies too heavily on the first piece of information it receives, the anchor, when making decisions.
So in a military context, if a commander has a book of past solutions sitting on his desk,
His brain will naturally try to fit any new, unprecedented crisis into one of those old boxes. It limits lateral thinking.
MacArthur knew that the war against Japan in the Pacific was fundamentally different from any war fought before.
The technology was different. The terrain was different.
By burning the books, he was violently removing the anchor.
He forced his staff to look at the reality of the battlefield as it actually was, not as it used to be.
Burn them all. I'll not be bound by precedents. Anytime a problem comes up, I'll make the decision at once immediately.
He demanded a mind completely unbound by the past, reacting to circumstances exactly as they happened in real time.
It's the ultimate expression of the Gordian knot mentality.
This raises an important question, though. As with any deep dive, we cannot just accept this at face value.
Right. We have to look at the blind spots.
We have talked extensively about slaying the father, burning the books, and rebelling against the past.
But we have to ask the critical question, is rebelling always the right move?
What if the past actually holds something incredibly valuable?
What happens when you rebel just for the sake of rebelling, without the competence to replace what you've destroyed?
This brings us to the mediocrity trap.
And this is where the advice gets painfully real.
Because it turns out, playing the rebel and burning the playbook is actually incredibly dangerous if you don't have the sheer, undeniable talent to back it up.
Look at the story of Joseph II, the son of the great Austrian Empress Maria Theresa.
Joseph inherits the throne and instantly wants to establish his own identity.
He wants to be the opposite of his mother.
Maria Theresa was regal, aristocratic, grand, and deeply respectful of tradition.
So Joseph decides to play the people's emperor.
He dresses like an ordinary citizen. He insists on staying in regular inns instead of palaces when he travels.
He is doing the whole symbolic differentiation thing by the book.
But there was a fatal flaw in his execution.
He fundamentally misunderstood his mother's success.
Maria Theresa wasn't just regal. She was highly competent and beloved.
She ruled wisely because she had learned statecraft the hard way over many decades.
She had genuine substance beneath the grand symbols.
And Joseph II, well, frankly, he was mediocre.
He was making a massive show of doing the opposite of his mother, but he lacked her intelligence, her instinct, and her political grace.
He alienated the nobility without actually improving the lives of the peasants.
And the brutal lesson here is that if you are ordinary, if you do not possess the generational genius of an Alexander the Great or a Picasso, you are far better off just keeping your head down.
Learn from your predecessor's actual hard-earned knowledge. Don't throw away a winning formula just to soothe your own ego.
Exactly. You must have the humility to appropriate what is useful.
Even Alexander the Great, who hated his father and slashed the Gordian knot, still kept his father's impeccably organized Macedonian army.
He didn't disband the phalanx just to make a point. You don't throw away perfectly good tools.
Napoleon III is another fantastic example of managing this nuance.
Napoleon III was brilliant at riding the line between inheriting and reinventing.
He used the massive legendary name of his grand uncle Napoleon Bonaparte as a stepping stone.
He rode the nostalgia of that glorious name to get himself elected as the first president and eventually emperor of France.
He milked the inheritance for all it was worth to get his foot in the door.
But the crucial part is what he did next. The second he was securely in power, he swiftly changed course.
He didn't try to conquer all of Europe like his uncle.
He focused on domestic infrastructure, rebuilding Paris, and modernizing the economy.
He carefully managed public expectations so people wouldn't constantly demand that he attain the exact same towering military heights Bonaparte had attained.
He wore the giant's shoes to get inside the house, and then he immediately took them off and put on his own.
It is a calculated temporary adoption of the shadow.
But there is an even darker, more insidious psychological trap waiting for those who successfully rebel and establish their own power over decades.
It is a phenomenon we can call the boomerang effect.
The boomerang.
The terrifying reality that no matter how hard you run, no matter how entirely you reinvent yourself, you might just turn into the exact thing you spend your whole life running from.
The historical example of this is profoundly tragic, and we can look at it purely through the lens of psychological regression.
It concerns Mao Zedong.
As a young man, Mao fiercely rebelled against his father.
His father was a strict man who heavily valued manual labor over intellectual pursuit.
Young Mao scoffed at this. He found his identity by struggling against his father's traditional views.
Reading voraciously and, by extension, struggling against the overbearing cultural shadow of Confucius that had dominated Chinese society for centuries.
He built his entire revolutionary persona on overturning the old paternal order.
He defined his whole youth by violently rejecting the father figure.
But then he ages. He gains absolute, unchecked power.
And as an older man, an incredibly dark psychological irony unfolds.
Mao unconsciously reverts back to his father's exact views.
The neural pathways of his youth, the ghost of the father, creep back in.
Mao begins to echo those same outdated ideas, expressing a severe anti-intellectualism.
This psychological regression culminated in the Cultural Revolution, and again, ensuring a strictly impartial, factual delivery of this historical event. The outcome was devastating.
He forced an entire generation of Chinese intellectuals, scientists, and teachers out of the cities and into brutal manual labor in the fields.
It was a disastrous regression that devastated his own country.
The psychological takeaway here is chilling. As the aphorism goes, remember, you are your own father.
You can spend decades meticulously creating your own unique identity, throwing off the weight of the past and changing the rules.
But as we age, our brains naturally seek the path of least resistance.
If you let your guard down, the ghost of history, the deep-seated habits of your upbringing will sneak back in and possess you.
You will become the very oppressor you once overthrew, imposing the exact same rigid rules on the next generation that you once fought against.
That is heavy, because it implies that the battle is never actually over.
It isn't.
So when you finally do reach the top, when you become the established power, the oak tree blocking the sun, how do you handle the next generation?
Because there is always a new Alexander the Great waiting in the wings, looking at you, ready to slash your knot.
You have to defend against them.
And historically, established powers often use the exact same Machiavellian tactics to suppress the youth that they once used to rise.
Consider the strategy of the great Baroque artist and architect Pietro Bernini.
Bernini was a master of his craft, but he was also a master at sniffing out younger potential rivals and neutralizing them before they could rebel and steal his sunlight.
The story of how he handled Francesco Borromini is so devious.
Borromini was a young, fiercely brilliant stonemason.
One day he shows his architectural sketches to Bernini.
Bernini looks at them and instantly recognizes that this kid is an absolute genius.
He is a massive threat to Bernini's dominance in Rome.
So what does Bernini do? He doesn't banish him or fight him.
He instantly hires Borromini as his chief assistant.
Borromini is thrilled, thinking this is his big break, a chance to learn from the master.
But it was a calculated trap.
Bernini didn't hire him to mentor him. He hired him to keep him close, to swallow him in his own massive shadow.
By making Borromini his subordinate, Bernini could claim credit for the young man's brilliant ideas.
Furthermore, he played psychological games on him, slowly eroding Borromini's confidence and creating a deep-seated inferiority complex.
Borromini remained brilliant, but his brilliance fueled Bernini's legacy, not his own.
He literally trapped him in the shoes.
And Bernini made a lifelong practice of this. He did the exact same thing to a great up-and-coming sculptor named Alessandro Algardi,
ensuring Algardi could only ever find work as his assistant.
If anyone tried to strike out on their own, Bernini used his vast network to ruin their career.
He understood that the only way to protect his own legacy was to ensure no one else could find a vacuum.
It's dark, but it proves the point. Once you become the father figure, you have to constantly watch out for the sons.
It reveals a never-ending cycle of power. You rebel, you reinvent, you establish dominance.
And then you must defend that dominance against the exact same rebellious energy that fueled your own rise.
Which brings us full circle.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's trace the arc of this incredible journey.
We started with the absolute fatal curse of the inheritance.
Being handed a beautiful, peaceful kingdom or a booming company doesn't breed greatness. It breeds fatal inertia, boredom, and eventually ruin.
Just like Louis XV letting France rot from the inside out.
Human beings are organisms built for the climb. Without necessity, without the dread of failure pushing us, our cognitive edge blunts.
And to avoid that rot, if you do inherit the crown, you have to psychologically start from zero.
You cannot merely untie the intricate knots left by your predecessors. You have to emulate Alexander the Great and violently slash them.
You have to invent your own paradigm.
You have to endure the unconscious guilt of the chess match, that feeling of imposter syndrome when you finally replace the giant.
You have to actively hunt for the vacuums, refusing to compete under the canopy of the great oak tree.
Find the empty space, like Pericles shifting his focus to the poor, or Velázquez painting with coarse realism.
Invent new symbols to differentiate yourself, and when necessary, burn the books of precedent to eliminate the anchoring bias of the past.
Unless, of course, you realize you're mediocre, in which case just take notes and keep the machine running.
But above all, you have to remain fiercely vigilant that as you age and gain power, you don't boomerang back into the ghost of the past you tried to escape.
Which leaves us with a final, profound concept to mull over for the learner listening right now.
We have spent this entire deep dive talking extensively about the mechanics of slaying the predecessor who came before you, the father, the mentor, the founder.
But there is a twist.
What happens when the greatest predecessor you have to slay is yourself?
Oh, wow.
What do you do when your own past successes, your own early triumphs, become the heavy crown that makes you terrified to innovate today?
If you want to maintain your power and your edge in a constantly shifting world, you cannot just rest on your laurels.
You might just have to burn your own playbook and start from nothing all over again.
Slaying yourself to save yourself, returning to that magnificent, flawless mansion we talked about at the very beginning. Maybe the only way to truly own it isn't to live in it.
Maybe the only way to claim your own identity and keep your edge sharp is to burn the beautiful house down to the foundation.
Clear away the ashes and finally build something that is entirely undeniably yours. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
Go out there, find your vacuum, and carve your own entirely new path.